Now that we have the basics of our game manager in place, let's look into how we can set up our game. We're going to create a method called resetGame that'll get called whenever we want to create a new game. In this case, it's simply going to turn the spawner on, and we're going to get a reference of the player, either from the object pool or have the object pool create a new player for us. First, let's select the player instance in the scene and select Apply to its prefab to make sure that any changes we've made are now saved to the prefab. Then we're going to delete it from the scene. Next, let's select the Game Manager and double-click on the Game Manager script to open it up in MonoDevelop. At this point, we now know that the floor and the spawner are going to work by getting our own reference during the awake method. So let's make these two properties private so we don't see them in the inspector. Above this, we're going to need a reference to the player prefab so we can actually create it when we reset our game. This we're going to want to make as a public game object, and we'll call it player prefab. And finally, we're going to need a reference to store our player's instance in, and we're going to make this a private game object instance called player. Now, below our update method, let's add a new method that'll reset our game. Inside of resetGame, we're going to set the spawner to be active, and then we're going to ask our GameObjectUtility to create an instance of the player prefab. Here, we'll set it to the player property, and we'll call our GameObjectUtility. We'll use the instantiate method. We'll pass in the property of our player prefab, and now we're going to want to calculate where the player needs to go. In this case, we're going to create a new vector3, and here we're going to want its x position to be 0, and we're going to need to calculate the height of where to put him. We'll divide the screen height value by the pixel perfect camera pixels to units divided by 2. And since this is positive, this will make it the top of the screen. And now let's set the z value to 0 and close out this method. We'll save our game and go back into Unity. Now when Unity refreshes, you'll see we have a reference to the player prefab. Let's click on the icon next to the field. We'll pull up this panel to select our game object, and we'll select the player. Now, if we were to start the game, nothing would actually happen, and that's because we're not calling resetGame. Eventually, we'll have a way of restarting the game simply by clicking anywhere on the screen when the game is over. And now, we're going to have to go back into MonoDevelop, and at the end of the start method, so that we can test that this all works, let's call resetGame. We'll save our script, go back into Unity, and hit play. Now you'll see the player gets created, but when the player goes off the screen, the game still keeps running. Now, let's look into how we can actually end the game.